Hello, Philippines. My name is Eric Lecain, and welcome to the World News Jam right here on RJTV Channel 224 Sky Cable and DZRJ Radio 810 AM on your radio dial. Also TV Plus boxes, Facebook, and YouTube, bringing you the most interesting stories going on around the world, keeping you entertained as well as slamming you with a bucket full of knowledge. Thank you so much for spending your Halloween evening here with us, right here on the Jam. So let's get this show rocking. But first, our hearts and prayers go out to the families of the people caught up in the stampede that happened at the Halloween parade there in South Korea. This just happened last night, so we are still getting information. But what we do know is that 151 people lost their lives, including 19 foreign nationals, in an apparent stampede during the festivities there. This morning, the president wished speedy recovers for all those injured, and there was a lot, and a time of mourning for all those who lost their lives. This is one of the single worst disasters ever in South Korea, as most of the casualties are teenagers and people in their 20s. There's lots of conflicting stories coming out about the incident, so I don't know yet the real story of what happened. There are still people missing, and authorities have not given an official reason why the stampede occurred, but it's definitely a very tough situation there in South Korea. Meanwhile, back here in the Philippines, man, did it rain this week or what? I mean, there are some major downpours been here in the city. The streets are all flooded. The highway had a pond in the middle of it. Seems almost like every week there's a storm with some name attached to it. This week's storm really did come blasting through. 45 people are already known dead from flooding and landslides, and many people are still missing. Now, I know what you're saying. In the Philippines, this happens all the time. Every year, it rains, it floods, and people die. It's always a surprise, isn't it? Like, OMG, I can't believe how big this storm is. But doesn't it seem like more than usual, like there's more storms? Well, theoretically, there is more than before. On average, there are more storms this year than there were the year before. And before that, and actually before that. As we have discussed in past shows, it's due to the rising temperature of the Earth now. This rise in temperature is still being debated as to whether it's man-made or not. However, it very much seems to be leaning toward man's use of fossil fuels and the carbon that it sends into the atmosphere. Now, of course, there have been lots of policies within countries and lots of promises and lots of commitments to try and use less fossil fuels. But sometimes it's hard to keep your promises when you need to get reelected to office or you need big oil corporations to give you money. Only 26 of the 139 countries that agreed last year to step up their actions to slow the heating of the planet have actually followed through. I think we have said on the show multiple times that as leaders change, so does the world. You may have one leader that says one thing, and then that leader is quickly changed, and the new leader comes in. One minute your country is part of the world coalition on saving the planet, and the next minute you're burning down the rainforest, one of the largest sources of the world's oxygen. This past week, the European Union said it could only fulfill its emission reduction pledges when its members agreed on upcoming climate laws. But when will that happen? Then you have a place like the UK, which has had 3 different leaders in 2 months. You have the energy crisis, global inflation, political turmoil. You have a war going on, which threatens the way of an entire continent, how it heats its homes. Speaking of the war again, there's new speculation this week that the war may very well help the climate crisis in the long run. Russia playing games with its natural gas and Europe desperately needing it. Europe is picking up the pace and trying to figure out how it's going to get around using Russia's fuel to heat its people's homes during the winter. The problem is that even though many countries are switching to cleaner ways of creating this heat, some countries have just thrown up their hands and said, oh, we're switching back to coal. Of course, coal being the biggest polluter of all the fuels, Like I said, a country may be totally on board, and then things change. Study came out last week that says that currently the Earth will be 5 degrees higher by the year 2100. Now, if the temperature goes up 5 degrees, humans can survive. Well, most humans. Problem is that the heat rising, these storms will continue to increase in frequency and intensity. That's not a guess, that's a scientific fact. Part of the world will have to deal with food shortages, land displacement, fires, and there are some places on the planet that will grow to be so hot they will be simply uninhabitable. According to the UN this week, the world is getting closer to the point of no return. Their report shows the world is currently falling short of its goals as a whole, and that the plan was good, but many are no longer following the plan. The point of no return, as it's now called, is right now slated at 2035. This is the time in which, if we don't start doing what we say, we will end up at that increase of 5 degrees in 2100. At that point, you will probably need to sell your beachfront property because it will be underwater. I'm not kidding. There's something scientists are calling the tipping point. If we trigger that tipping point, then it doesn't matter what we do later. We cannot reverse what will happen. There will be so much carbon emissions in the air that we can no longer control it or lessen it enough to stop the inevitable. It's like you're running down a hill and you're going so fast, at some point you just can't stop anymore. One of the first things is the Amazon rainforest. It will break down. You can't fix that. And we need that rainforest. It sucks up the CO2 in the air and provides that all-important O2 we humans love so much. The Greenland ice sheet, once that begins to dislodge, there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. Scientists have said no matter what we do, no matter how good we are, even if everyone stops driving a car all at once, it would no longer matter. The latest in CTP studies, that's the climate tipping point, it says that we need to stay under 1.5 degrees in order to stop a major climate catastrophe. But right now, we are on our way to 5 degrees. Like I said, we humans can handle 5 degrees or more. Just wear a short sleeve shirt. But if the Arctic shelf were to heat to the point of falling into the ocean, sea levels will change, not in inches, but in feet. This will change the places that we can live. In simulations, the ocean could move inland hundreds of miles. Entire countries would vanish. Makes you wonder what might happen here in the Philippines, right? And even though the climate would be hotter, the seasonal streams of air that change as the Earth rotates around the sun would be thrown off. Winters could become way colder in the northern countries, and economics alone could be overwhelming to certain parts of the Earth. Right now, every month, a climate record is being broken, either for hot weather or cold weather, for speed of wind, for amount of rain, or the size of a wildfire, or the size of a drought. In fact, droughts going on right now are the worst known in the history of man. Scientists from the Earth, Atmosphere, and Environment of Monash University said that our slow progress in restraining the growth of greenhouse gases means that the world will not be able to restrain global warming significantly to avoid at least some permanent damaging impacts in the near future. My old girlfriend used to say to me, "Eric, you're very good at talking and making promises, but you're not so good at doing things you say." And eventually she broke up with me. Right now, we as a world are making lots of promises and showing we want to fix this problem. However, as a world, we are not so good at doing the things we say. Of the actual pushing forward on our promises and staying clear of the point of no return, because if we don't do something soon, the world, like my girlfriend, may very well break up with us. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. Well, of course, the biggest story going around the world this week is voting. There are two big elections coming down the pipe. The first one on tap is the Brazilian presidential election. Now, this election will have two candidates, one named Luiz Lula da Silva, who was actually president before, back in 2003, and someone who we are very familiar with here on the show, Jair Bolsonaro, who is currently the president, looking for another 4-year term. Now, the reason why I say familiar is that we have done a number of stories on his tumultuous time in office. In fact, it wasn't that long ago that he was faced with the possibility of impeachment from office. A poll this past summer found that more than half of the public think he's a bad or awful president. A lot of this is due to the fallout of his handling of the COVID pandemic, in which, much like the U.S. President Donald Trump, he played down the virus, claiming that it really wasn't that bad, and that the media had blown the whole thing out of proportion. However, in the end, around 550,000 people died during the virus in Brazil, and so far, a rather small amount of the public has even been vaccinated. People have labeled him the Trump of the tropics because of his incredible likeness to the U.S. president. Now, they don't look alike. However, their concept of politics is dead on. For instance, Bolsonaro is not so environmentally friendly. During his time as president, 8.4 million acres of rainforest disappeared. Many species of plants and animals were wiped from the face of the earth, all to create big incomes to corrupt politicians and companies. But beyond all the allegations of the rainforest corruption, and the COVID pandemic is what got Bolsonaro's people talking about him so much. He resisted lockdowns and mask wearing during the height of the pandemic. And there's the ongoing investigations of him buying 20 million vaccines, in which he jacked up the price over 1,000%. Besides this, the economy in Brazil was teetering on the brink of disaster as Bolsonaro did a very Trump-esque type tax cut to the richest people in the country and allowed China to become stakeholders in the economy, even though he would criticize them publicly. And while Trump wanted to end NAFTA, the economic partnerships with Mexico and Canada, the Brazilian president had the same stance with his partnerships with other countries in South America. So with all this, you might think that Bolsonaro has a huge chance of losing and being booted out of office, and you would be right. However, Bolsonaro took a very important play out of the Trump book, how to win an election even if people don't like you. He's using social media platforms to spread lies on a host of stories, which we won't go into, and he has said numerous times that if he loses, he won't leave office, that he won't recognize the outcome if he doesn't win. Any of that sound familiar to you? Because, of course, if he loses, he will have been cheated. But with all this bad news, and even if the president is incredibly unpopular, he's actually not doing all that badly. The ex-president Lula da Silva was ahead in the first polls. However, he didn't win by 50%, which you must have at least 50% in Brazil to outright win. Da Silva got 57.2 million votes, while Bolsonaro got 51 million, which means there will be a runoff election today, leading many to believe that with the incredible media campaign of Bolsonaro, he could conceivably win another term, or at least come close enough to claim the election was rigged against him. But there's one group that very well might shake up this election and make it impossible for him to win, and that's black women. And that is a problem for Bolsonaro because they are actually the largest demographic group in the country. They make up more than 25% of the entire voting population. And almost all are direct descendants of the last century's massive slave trade in Brazil. They are poor, they are many, and they don't like Bolsonaro. He's misogynistic and has a tendency, like Trump, to look down on poor people. That doesn't mean all of them are going to vote for Da Silva, who's a hero to the poor. There are still those old, more conservative evangelical types who you can't convince of the facts and believe Bolsonaro carries the moral high ground over his opponent, even though the current president did cut the budget to combat violence against women, especially by their husbands. He cut the budget by 90% and believes more on keeping a family together, even if there's violence in the marriage. And as you expect, he is totally pro-life and anti-abortion. Oh, and there's the subject of femicide, which we talked about here in the past on the show, in which a woman is killed just for the reason of being a woman, is a big problem in Brazil. Not a good subject for the current president, as there are substantial increases in violence to women during his term, especially during the time of the pandemic. It's so hard for many to believe that Bolsonaro has any chance of winning this election. But, they didn't give Trump much of a chance in the election against Hillary Clinton, yet somehow, with all the false information put out on social media, partly run by the Russians, according to the government investigation, he won. Trump did what Bolsonaro is trying to do now. But like Trump, this is his second term, and people have gotten to know him a bit better. So people are saying, surely Brazil is not dumb enough to let this guy win again. But Brazil is very emotional about its politics and its candidates, so who knows what could happen in this election. Now, on the TV, experts are trying every which way to predict what is going to happen in this election. Kind of like what's going on in the U.S. right now, with its elections coming right around the corner. Coming up this first week in November, the U.S. will have one of the most important midterm elections in decades. Now, this is the midterm elections, not the presidential elections. However, this one is just as important. This is the election for who will really have power in the country. Okay, so there are three equal branches of government in the U.S., the president, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Right now in the U.S., the Democrats control all three branches, mostly because after the 4 years of Trump, many people, even Republicans, voted against everything Trump. Many thought that the Republicans could not recover from this powerful show of distrust of them in the U.S. population. However, once Biden got into power, the Democrats have been having some trouble. After the horrible way the U.S. dealt with the pandemic, resulting in the cannonballs of inflation and the economy in the tank, well, the Dems are not looking too good. It was so bad that the Republicans were at first thought to shatter the Democratic Party, like throwing an election bowling ball into a bunch of glass pins. But things have not exactly gone to plan for the Republicans. Part of the reason is that some of the candidates are somewhat controversial or somewhat just freaking weird. Now, a lot of this has to do with the current favorite Republican, Donald Trump. Even though Trump is facing a number of court cases and controversy himself, he still has power and influence among his base of Trumpers, which for whatever reason happens to identify with Republicans.